Hello, I am back and I am going to read another chapter in a book entitled George V. It's a very interesting chapter. I started reading this yesterday and I want to at least get this chapter out of the way. I have a very, very busy week, but we were talking about how the monarch will award honors. And so there's King Charles offering honors. This is the British honors, one of the honors that they offer. So you can see that this is what they do. And oftentimes William will step in and do the investitures of these honors and these medals. So they are British Order of Honors, and they have quite a bit of different active orders of the United Kingdom, and they are the Order of the Garter, the Order of Thistle, the Order of Bath, Merit, St. Michael's George, Royal Victorian Order, Royal Victorian Chain, Distinguished Service Order, Order of the British Empire, Imperial Service Order, and Order of Companions Honors. So there's quite a bit of numerous of them. The British honor system is the most extensive of all the world monarchies' honor systems. The reigning monarch is the sovereign of each order as a font of honor, and all are awarded in his name or her name. Most are granted on the advice of the government. However, there are several that remain the sole gift of the sovereign. As times have changed and as the British Empire no longer exists as it once did, some orders have fallen into abeyance. None have been formally abolished, and in addition to those listed below, there are several national orders within the various realm. Each year, 2,600 people are responsible or are personally invested with these honors by the monarch or another senior member of the royal family. Twice a year, in the New Year's honor and the June birthday honors, as a list of honor recipients is published. Most honors are awarded on the advice of the Cabinet Office, and anybody can make a recommendation if they know someone they believe is worthy. So yeah, that's what we know about the honor system. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and reread this chapter. And this section is called Honors Not for Sale. And it's a handful of pages. So get started. The sale of titles was humiliating for the king and fatal to Lloyd George. Yet it was but one facet of an honor system that seemed to permeate every sphere of national life. Correspondence began between the palace and Downing Street. Itself, the distillation of wider consultations was incessant. A viceroy or a governor general sacrificed whole weeks of his working year in balancing the claims of one candidate and another. Curzon wrote, "The insatiable appetite of the British-speaking community all over the world for titles and precedence. By the end of his life, he himself had acquired a privy councillorship, an Irish barony, a United Kingdom earldom, and a marquisate. The Order of the Garter, the Order of the Star of India, the Order of the Indian Empire, and the Royal Victorian Chain." Honors there had always been. Not until the reign of King George V, however, did they cease to be the almost exclusive preserve of the well-born and well-established. The Order of the Garter, of the Thistle, and St. Patrick were confined to the sovereign's family, the land-owning nobility and elder statesmen, and occasional hero of the battlefield or of the war of sea. The bath was reserved for senior officers of the Army and the Royal Navy, the higher ranks of the civil service, a handful of politicians, and other public men. The St. Michael and St. George for the British officials overseas, particularly in the diplomatic and colonial services. The Order of the Star of India and the Indian Empire for those engaged in civilizing missions of the British Raj. The Royal Victorian Order for personal service to the sovereign. Nor until the present century was it generally resented that the aristocrat should have a prior claim on the distribution of honors. When, in 1886, Queen Victoria wished to bestow the Grand Cross of the Bath on Mr. W. H. Smith, the Conservative minister, he humbly asked leave to decline. Having spent his early years in trade, managing the family business of news agencies and bookstalls, he thought himself unworthy of a decoration which, until recently, at all events, has only been given to men of his social standing for very distinguished services. As of late 1908, Edward VII refused Asquith's submission that Edward Grey should have the Garter. He maintained that there was no precedent since Robert Walpole for bestowing so exalted an honor on a commoner, and that even a peer would be denied the order unless he were at least an earl. When the more realistic George V permitted his foreign secretary to become a Knight of the Garter 4 years later, his leniency was much more criticized in smart society. While seeking to preserve the nobility of the Garter in its strictest sense, Edward VII enlarged the boundaries of other honors. He scattered his own in profusion and encouraged his subjects to accept foreign ones. A generation earlier, even campaign medals were thought somewhat ostentatious. A crusty old general, eyeing the 3 Crimea medals worn at a regimental dinner by that noted agriculturist, Lord Strafford, he observed, "Buying has been lucky with his pigs." But Edward VII, he expanded the Royal Victorian Order 6-fold in the first 3 years of his reign, and Fitz Ponsonby, who during the 7 years he served Queen Victoria did not receive a single foreign decoration, acquired 18 of them in her son's reign. As the King's first Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury remarked, "Any vigorous attempt to restrict decorations would cause the demise of the crown." Edward VII founded a new honor, too. His Secretary for War, St. John Broderick, told a friend, "The King is giving us much trouble with orders. He showers decorations right and left. There is to be a new Order of Merit. It's limited to 24. I got it reduced from 60. It is for savants and soldiers. Its chief objects are that it is worn around the neck, and it puts Edward VII on par with Frederick the Great, who invented a similar one." From its inception in 1902, the Order of Merit, like the Royal Victorian Order, has remained in the personal gift of the sovereign. King Edward, however, did indicate his willingness to consider any names put forward by the Prime Minister. It was not until 1946 that the Garter and the Thistle similarly became the preserve of the sovereign, who makes appointments to both orders without ministerial advice. Okay, I remember this order of merit that they're talking about. This Queen Elizabeth gave Margaret Thatcher the Order of Merit. So King George V's opportunity to extend the scope of the honors list came with the war. Until 1914, there were few awards for gallantry. The Victorian Cross was given very sparingly to both officers and other ranks in recognition of the utmost heroism. The Distinguished Service Order rather more generously to officers of middle and senior rank. Junior officers now acquired their own rewards for courage. The Distinguished Service Cross for the Navy and the Military Cross for the Army. Later came a Distinguished Flying Cross. Like the DSO, these new decorations were at first given indiscriminately to staff officers and fighting officers alike. This demoralizing practice was later curbed. A parallel set of medals for gallantry was instituted for those below commissioned rank. Haig thought that the king was naive in his definition of physical courage, and when he expressed the opinion that the Victorian Cross should be given for carrying a wounded man out of action. The field marshal replied that there were medical dangers in carelessly moving a wounded man. Only to his diary did he confide that the military police were posted during a battle to prevent more unwounded men than necessary from accompanying a wounded man back from the firing line. It was equally charitable of the king that he should abolish the procedure by which holders of the V.C. convicted of serious criminal offenses forfeited the award. Civilians also had their share of new honors. Even before the war, Escher suggested a new order of chivalry for persons connected with territorial forces, charitable work of all kinds, missionary work overseas, etc., from which service is practically demanded by the state and who get no chance of recognition from their sovereign. After 1914, the need became imperative. Not until 1917 was the Order of the British Empire, the OBE, instituted. In recognition of the manifold services, voluntary and otherwise, that had been rendered both by the British subjects and their allies in connection with the war. The intervening years had been spent in luxuriant discussion of its name, statues, and insignia. The inaugural list of names reflected every type of war service at home and abroad, and no less the social revolution that had overtaken the nation during 3 years of war. From a royal duke, the governor of the Bank of England, and a future Lord Chancellor, it made its stately, all-embracing descent to factory foremen, munitions workers, and trade union officials. Another radical change proclaimed by the newest order of chivalry was the admittance of women on an absolute equality with men. Before 1917, the honor system scarcely recognized female existence, much less female distinction. Women had occasionally received peerages, although denied a seat in the House of Lords. Among them was the Duchess of Teck's friend, Angela Burdett Coutts. She was singled out for her philanthropy. The Order of Merit was ostensibly as welcoming to women as to men. But by 1917, Florence Nightingale alone of her sex had penetrated its rank. She was not admitted until her 88th year, and even then with considerable reluctance on the part of King Edward. The first investiture of the new order was held at Buckingham Palace in September 1917. It struck a less churlish note. Men and women mingled alphabetically to receive their insignia from the king. But the custom of the time, it was a bold decision. Not until the following year did women of 30 or more qualify for the vote. Women between the ages of 21 and 29 had to wait until 1928 for their political emancipation. Little more than a year after its institution, the Order of the British Empire was divided into two parts. Military division would in future be reserved for members of the armed forces, a civilian division for every other form of national service. Founded to reward endurance in war, it would henceforth recognize achievements in peace. As sovereign of the new order, the king wished to show that he esteemed it no less than the older, more patrician orders of chivalry. He therefore appointed the Prince of Wales to be its first Grand Master. His thoughtful gesture did not protect the order of the British Empire from ribaldry and disparagement during its early years. It was at first distributed too lavishly and too indiscriminately. One list of awards covered 60 quarto pages of the London Gazette. By the end of 1919, there was 22,000 recipients of all grades. Half a century later, that number quadrupled. George Robey, it was said, would shortly appear in the music hall wearing OBE trousers. In 1922, during a debate on honors in the House of Lords, the Duke of Devonshire, he read out a letter from a tout who had a knighthood for sale. Not of the British Empire, no nonsense of that kind, but the real thing. Soldiers, British and Allied alike, disdained an award identified as non-combatant service. The French scornfully referred to it as l'Ordre Britannique en Busque. One French heart, however, received it with gratitude, the Empress Eugenie, who had lived in England since her husband's defeat at Sedan in 1870. Almost 50 years later, on the eve of her 93rd birthday, the king sent his two elder sons to invest her with the Grand Cross of the British Empire in recognition of her having organized and paid for an Allied military hospital. Simultaneously with the Order of the British Empire, the king instituted the far smaller Order of the Companions of Honor. Of limited membership, it was devised towards service of national importance, but it carried neither title nor precedence. The first recipients, they were nearly all senior representatives of the munitions industry, agriculture, transport, nursing, and the press. The name of the Smuts was alone survived in the public memory. Not until a decade later could the order be spoken of as a comparable through less order of merit. The new labyrinth of awards laid an additional burden on the already overworked secretaries of Buckingham Palace and Whitehall. The honor system had long encroached upon their working day. Now it seemed to have acquired a life and purpose of its own. Although almost beyond ministerial control, the archives of the Lloyd George era reveal the great issues of war and peace and progress were forever jostled. They were even eclipsed by the minutiae of the stars and the ribbons, by an arcane precedent and obstructive practices. One such problem was the recognition of Lloyd George's incalculable wartime services. The most imaginative was the laurel wreath handed to him by the king on his return from Versailles. But that did not alone suffice. He could not be tempted by a peerage and banishment to the House of Lords. A grant of £100,000, such as given to Haig and Beatty, would require controversial legislation. So too would an addition to a prime minister's retirement pension of £2,000 a year. Some proposed that Lloyd George's might fittingly become the first knight of St. David. The king, however, had long ago rejected plans for a wholly Welsh order of chivalry. Stanfordham suggested the Garter, but Balfour was doubtful. It would be awkward for the prime minister to have to nominate himself for the order. In any case, he wrote, if we once again begin giving the Garter for merit, irrespective of rank, the troubles of the future prime ministers in recommending for that honor will be greatly increased. Bonar Law thought the Order of Merit would be the most suitable award, since it was given on the initiative of the sovereign without ministerial advice. The proposal did not please the king. He replied that civilian members of the order were required to be eminent in the arts, literature, or science, and that indeed the statutes seem to have been drawn up with the deliberate intention of excluding politicians. Although technically correct, the king was being disingenuous. He conferred the OM on Haldane in 1915, not in recognition of his Hegelian studies, but to the solace of an ill-used Lord Chancellor. And when in 1916 he had likewise honored Balfour for services to philosophy and literature, the Camden recipient warned Stanfordham that the OM ought to be reserved for those of outstanding distinction in their fields and not regarded as another reward open to party statesmen who combine literary or other interests with their political work. Balfour's letter continued, I think you will admit it to be most extraordinary of a coincidence that out of 13 gentlemen chosen purely for their eminence in literature, science, or art, no less than 5 should be privy councillors and ex-cabinet ministers. Ostensibly, all 5 statesmen have received the Order of Merit for their services to learning and to the arts. Even had Bryce and George Otto Trevelyan not been politicians, one might still have been honored for his Holy Roman Empire, and the other for his Life and Letters of Lord Macaulay. It is far more doubtful whether the same exalted recognition would have been given to Balfour's defense of philosophical doubt, Haldane's pathway to reality, or Morley's Life of Gladstone. Since this statutes had already been strained thus far, they could surely be made to admit a civilian war leader. even one who had scarcely ever put pen to paper. After a strong plea to the king by Bonar Law, the Prime Minister became a member of the Order of Merit. Within a few weeks, Lloyd George's friends were again busy on his behalf. Churchill, as Secretary for War, submitted to the king that the Prime Minister should have the Distinguished Service Order. The king dismissed the suggestion out of hand. The statutes precluded any civilian from receiving that award. Churchill then asked that Lloyd George should have 3 war medals issued to all members of the armed forces which the requisite service. It was a persuasive letter. As the Prime Minister must have 30 or 40 journeys to France and was on several occasions in zones where shells were falling, and as all these journeys were made in strict performance of necessary duty of the highest possible consequence, Mr. Churchill considers that the grant of the war medals in these circumstances will be in every respect appropriate. The king held that such medals were never meant for civilians, but he felt obliged to yield when he learned that Churchill, in his cavalier way, had already promised them to Lloyd George, and that the Prime Minister would rather have them than an earldom. The king did, however, insist on 2 conditions: that Asquith should also receive 3 war medals, but no other minister should unless, like Churchill, he had earned them in the field while out of office. Not until Churchill had pleaded Lloyd George's cause did he have the grace to write another letter, asking the king to accept the war medals. The king, who nearly always emerged from these encounters more credibly than his ministers, replied that he was ready to acquiesce, though I have in no way earned these honorable distinctions. With almost the entire honors list at his disposal, Lloyd George might have been expected to leave the king in an undisputed control of the Order of Merit. It was, after all, by the royal favor that he himself could hang its blue and red ribbons around his neck. In any case, the king was proud to be the guardian of the order, and he took immense care in maintaining its standards of excellence. Thus, Stamford wrote on the author of the Golden Bow, "You can imagine difficulty in selecting the right people for the OM. For 2 years or more, we have been endeavoring to get a conscientious opinion in Fraser's favor, and on the whole succeeded in doing so." In 1921, on the suggestion of Balfour and other similarly thorough inquiries, the king proposed that Gilbert Murray, the classical scholar, should be admitted to the order. Before the appointment was gazetted, the king followed his usual practice of informing Lloyd George as a matter of courtesy. To his astonishment, the Prime Minister replied that Murray's name must be withdrawn. He alleged that during the war, Murray had been a pacifist and almost pro-German, adding that it would cause much more annoyance to the Unionist Party, who were already in a mood which required to be placated rather than irritated. The king replied that politics did not enter into the matter and that the Prime Minister had no say in disposing of the Order of the Merit. Lloyd George, however, insisted, and the king abandoned his proposal rather than risk a constitutional conflict. Murray eventually received the OM from King George VI in 1941. Two former prime ministers, Rosebery and Balfour, privately expressed their sense of outrage that the sovereign's absolute discretion had been challenged. But it was an isolated episode, and for the rest of the reign, the king met with no resistance to his candidates. The king nevertheless suffered other setbacks in trying to curb the proliferation and preservance of the traditions of the order and decorations awarded in his name. Here he found himself thwarted by successive British governments anxious to use them as emollients of foreign policy. Not even the Victorian Cross was exempt. In 1921, the United States spontaneously offered her Medal of Congress to the British unknown warrior, who had been buried at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of November, 1920. Then came the burial of the American unknown warrior in Arlington Cemetery in Washington. How was the tribute to be reciprocated? Curzon wrote in some trepidation to Stamfordham, "The Prime Minister thinks very strongly that we shall be forced to strain a point that no decoration but the V.C. will suffice." Stamfordham's long and unyielding reply declared that the king had declined to give the V.C. even to the British unknown warrior, for the statutes of the decoration stated that neither rank nor long service nor wounds nor any other circumstances or condition whatsoever, save the merit of conspicuous bravery, shall be held to establish a sufficient claim to the honor. The letter concluded on a note. Further, His Majesty considers that to compare the Victorian Cross, the highest military decoration in the world, as an equivalent to the Congress Medal, which has only now been stuck and with no history behind it, is to lose sight of all proportion, even with a view of satisfying political or international susceptibilities. But as so often when the expediency met principle, Lloyd George had his own. On the 11th of November, 1921, the American unknown warrior, having earlier been invested with the Victorian Cross by Beatty, was buried in state. Hankey, who attended the ceremony, reported unfavorably on it to the Prime Minister. It was much too long, with a curious medley of prayers, hymns, long speeches, musical performances by a quartet from the New York Opera, absurd little speeches by foreign officers, laying decorations, and repeated wreath-laying. The finale was a curious function by an old Indian chief dressed up like a picture in one of Fenimore Cooper's books. But I could not see it very well because the lady in front of me had a headdress like the Indian chief's. A year later, it is sad to relate, at the burial of Belgium's unknown warrior, that small nation in whose defense Britain had gone to war in 1914, fared less well than the United States. The military cross would be quite sufficient for the Belgians, Stanford had told the War Office. There was another exchange of views between the palace and the Foreign Office on the suggestion award of the Garter to the Shah of Persia. Both King and Foreign Secretary agreed that the order should be no longer conferred upon non-Christian sovereigns, in spite of two previous Shahs and two emperors of Japan having received it. But like his father and his grandmother before him, King George V was eventually obliged to break the rule for political ends. In 1929, the Emperor Hirohito became the third of his line to wear the blue riband. Perhaps the most bizarre of all correspondence and honors for foreigners preceded the king's state visit to Italy in 1923. Would Mussolini be satisfied with the GCMG, or must he have the superior GCB? Although required to conform to every ministerial whim, the king made earlier demands, only modest demands. Harold Nicolson writes that in the masses of documents bearing on the bestowal of honors now stored in the archives at Windsor, only one instance can be found of King George himself writing to ask that an honor be conferred. That, as we shall see, it is not quite true. But the single episode which he quotes is illuminating. In 1930, the king suggested that an inventor of flying boats, E.S. Sanders, who was personally known to him, should receive a knighthood. The Prime Minister's private secretary replied that there were other inventors who had prior claims, that in any case, Downing Street was snowed under with applications. The king minuted on his nonchalant response. I only hope that the spade used will be a large one and the snow not too deep. As I so often ask for a knighthood, I really think that I might be treated with some consideration occasionally. This shamed Downing Street into a further letter, which Nicholson does not quote. It explained that Saunders, as chairman of the Conservative Association, could not fittingly be rewarded by a Labour Prime Minister, even for aeronautical services. In fact, he made several requests over the years, though always sparingly. None was more persistent than his plea for A.J. Bennett's baronetcy. None more emphatic than his demand on behalf of Frederick Kenyon, director of the British Museum. I am directed by the king, Knowles wrote to Asquith, to say that he must decline to consider the recommendation of the Prime Minister for honors until the name of Mr. Kenyon is included among them. Kenyon was made KCB shortly afterwards. Medicine and the stage were professions which the king liked to see well rewarded. He was successful in securing immediate knighthoods for Frederick William Hewitt, an anesthetist, and for Morris Abbott Anderson, a physician and surgeon to the Princess Royale for more than 20 years. A versatile practitioner whose contributions to learned journals include replacements of severed portions of the nose and foreign bodies in rectum. But Milsom Rees, a laryngologist, both to the royal household and to Covent Garden, had to wait 5 years. The actor George Alexander was similarly knighted at the king's suggestion. 10 years later, Stanfordham consulted H.A.L. Fisher as to whether Gerald de Moore or Charles Hawtrey was the more deserving. One was the king's choice, and the other was Lloyd George's. Both received the accolade in 1922. Ben Greer was another actor-manager to be knighted on the king's recommendation. By contrast, Prebendary Carlyle of the Church Army and General William Booth of the Salvation Army each became a companion of honor at his behest. The king could not, however, persuade Lloyd George to ennoble General Sir Charles Munro. Stanfordham wrote of the rebuff. Had he continued to occupy the position of an army commander in France, which he vacated to go to India, he would have received a peerage and a money grant. The Prime Minister would not recommend the peerage, but it is whispered that the opposition came from the Secretary of State for War. It seems to me very unfair. Stanford Ham's surmise was almost certainly correct. Churchill never forgave Monroe for having presided over the withdrawal from Gallipoli, writing of him in his world-class crisis. He came, he saw, and he capitulated. It is Churchill, too, who discerns the fatal flaw in every honors list. A medal glitters, he told the House of Commons, but it also casts a shadow. For the one hungry sheep that is fed, 100 look upon in vain. Thus, it was throughout the reign of King George V, both the sovereign and his ministers, in varying degrees, tried to regulate the flow equitably, but the experience was dispiriting. Their postbags were heavy with the servilities of the aspirant and the reproaches of the frustrated. Neither rank nor achievement precluded an appetite at once was ravenous and without shame. The sale of titles was contemptible, but it was not alone in poisoning national life. Over the fountain of honors hung a perpetual miasma of envy and discontent. And that is the end of the section on honors not for sale in the King George book. So this is a very fascinating topic. As we know, many people and many actors and actresses receive them. Military people receive them, and it's a very interesting topic. So my next topic, which I will read about, is going to be Upheavals at number 10 Downing Street. So I'm going to resume this on Tuesday of this week, so I hope you'll follow along as I continue to finish out the chapter on Restless Decade. Thank you very much for listening, and be sure to check out this documentary, and I'm going to show you the documentary. It is on the People's Profile, and I'm just going to play this a little bit. It's called The People's Profile, King George V. It's a documentary that lasts about an hour and 10 minutes, but it's a very fascinating visual documentary written and organized by the People's Profile channel, and it's a pretty good documentary. You can listen to it and just be fascinated by the life of King George V and all that he dealt with regard to the Irish Home Rule, the Great War, when he ascended the throne. He's a constitutional monarch, and in dealing with his prime ministers, and again, he didn't get a lot of say-so, but he was a dedicated king, and I would encourage you to check this documentary out. So I'm just going to play it for you for a little bit.
Would be established in Dublin, one which would rule many aspects of Ireland, albeit still as part of the British Empire. However, the war years saw this consensus fall apart. On Easter week in 1916, a coalition of nationalist revolutionaries had led a botched military revolt against British rule, seizing large parts of Dublin. This was soon crushed, but in its aftermath, support for the Irish Parliamentary Party collapsed and was replaced with support for a new political movement, Sinn Féin.
When you get car insurance, you get a price based on all these drivers.
Okay, so that's very, very good documentary. And if you want to watch a movie about that portrays some of the issues about Ireland. And there is a movie in which that is a very good movie. It's a war thriller movie by Michael Collins. It's played by Liam Neeson, and it discusses some of the issues with regard to Ireland's quest for home rule. And Liam Neeson does a wonderful portrayal. It's a biographical historical drama film, and it's a really good portrayal. Well worth your time to watch this film. So I would watch it. I would recommend it. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be back sometime this week, hopefully Tuesday, to read the next section entitled Upheavals at number 10 in the chapter 7, the Restless Decade. You can read this book at thriftbook.com if you can catch it. Find it in the library. It's written by Kenneth Rose, or any book on King George V. I highly recommend it, and I appreciate your time.